Um, well, in any case, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stan Trembach, and I am currently an assistant professor at the School of Library and Information Management at Emporia State University. And thank you, everyone, for attending this webinar. And also, I have to say thanks to those of you who may be watching later on the recording as well. I am personally really excited to have this opportunity to talk to you all today about information literacy practices of the so-called non-traditional information seekers. And this is rather a broad term that encompasses a lot of different categories of library users that may be underserved or marginalized for one reason or another. By virtue of my position, my particular research and actually teaching interests are in the international student population. So this will be the focus of my presentation. We will touch upon the ACRL framework for information literacy in higher education, some very briefly, in fact, but primarily what we're going to be focusing on is the fact that literacy education takes on a completely new meaning and a new significance, I think, for learners that may not have the same ethnic or sociocultural backgrounds as the patrons, the customers who we typically work with in libraries of all kinds, academic, public, and special. And so this topic, the title you see on the screen, and all of its parts, it is in fact very near and dear to my heart because, as I've alluded to, my professional background before coming to Emporia last fall is in teaching and literacy education. I was an academic librarian for a good 10, 15 years previously. So I will be speaking from an academic library perspective a lot. And I was also a subject specialist for education, foreign languages, psychology, and several other liberal arts programs. So this presentation today is largely based on my current research interests but also on the work that I did in the past 4 years before joining Emporia State, when I was the educational librarian and also liaison for the Center for International Education at the University of Northern Colorado. So shout out to them here, UNC. But first things first, what you see on this slide is the ACRL framework, the 6 frames or the threshold concepts, as we refer to them, that was adopted by ACRL in 2016. And there's certainly an undeniable value in my mind in this framework for our field and for higher education in general. But I think it's not really accidental that from the very beginning, it has been subject to a lot of debate, right? If not downright criticism by so many in the scholarly circles and also practicing librarians. So when we look at these threshold concepts, we cannot help but think that these are rather ambiguous. That's the first notion in my mind. So when you apply them to practice in the real world classroom, these ideas like information creation as a process or searching as strategic exploration, these ideas just don't seem to be the easiest to comprehend by both students and instructors at times, right? And above all, my question has always been, how do we implement them when we're facing a fairly large group of, say, sophomore students, and we are trying to conduct usually a one-shot literacy instruction session for them as part of perhaps their general education course? So how do you implement these ideas? But on top of these logistical concerns, if you will, quite often we tend to feel pressure from our good colleagues, that's the teaching faculty. At least I know that I have felt this pressure to just, cover a couple of resources relevant to the classroom assignment. And after this happens, they would much rather move on with their curriculum than let us engage in meaningful but lengthy discussions about searching as strategic exploration or the contextual nature of authority, for that matter. So this is often the cards we're dealt with as librarians, but actually the fact of the matter is that for the 21st century learner, for the information seeker today, this framework, and this is my deep conviction that this framework can and should be the foundation of everything we do as instructors and of course as librarians in the public sphere. And to me, the real value and the real significance of this ACRL framework is that it serves as a bridge between information literacy theory and practice. So my goal today will be to show you that, with a bit of creativity, of course, and tweaking our traditional approaches to library instruction, this framework in itself offers quite a few flexible options actually for implementation. And I will try to demonstrate how I did this as a librarian in the past at the University of Northern Colorado as I developed instructional content for an audience of the so-called non-traditional and specifically international students. So once again, if you look at the traditional interpretation of the ACRL framework, you're likely to come across what this diagram essentially represents. And that is the notion that information literacy is a phenomenon resting at the intersection of basic reading skills and the technology skills and abilities that students need to obviously search for, locate information, and also assess, evaluate information quality, and use that information ethically. So upon the first glance, on the surface, this seems to be quite a legitimate approach because I think you all would agree that locating and using information ethically would be some of the more crucial skills that we all want our students to develop. But the one issue that I have discovered with this view from my own research and actually professional practice is that this approach tends to overlook the complexity of the information phenomenon itself in today's society, and also the fact that information can mean quite different things to a lot of different people. So, and we cannot possibly forget about this fact. This is exactly why I am advocating for this expanded view of information literacy in the 21st century, again, because I believe we have to adopt this broadened view on education, on libraries of all kinds, and on information literacy as, to me, the key factor that determines the long-term success of our students, of library visitors, if you will. Particularly if we consider the continuing technological changes and also the general volatile circumstances we live in across the board. And I don't want to be overly political here, but I believe you all know what I'm referring to here. So I have been doing some research recently that looks into the so-called hard and soft skills that college graduates, not only LIS program graduates, but also college graduates in general, are expected to have by the demand of the workforce. In plain language, those can be presented as basically technical versus people or social skills. However, the world today, all the crises aside, is a very, very interconnected place. And then in this reality, educators and librarians, we're called upon to provide a completely new set of skills. And I don't want to call it exactly new, but it's an expanding skills, an ever-growing set of skills. I call it soft skills version 2.0. And those, as you see here on the right, those definitely include critical thinking, the ability to problem solve or take the initiative to perform well under different kinds of pressure, and also be accountable for your actions. But one of the new skills that I wanted to highlight here, because that's increasingly coming into the focus of in academia, is related to cultural competencies. And cultural competencies, this notion stems from the idea of global citizenship, and that's the acknowledgement that we are all one global community. And therefore, our choices and actions, the decisions, the informed decisions we make or are supposed to make with the information we access, those decisions may affect people and communities, both locally, nationally, or even internationally. And just in very simple terms, global citizenship, the way I've read about it, means respect and tolerance for others, global awareness, and even empathy. And even if your library district or your classroom is not extremely diverse at the moment, it is my belief that there are always ways to bring in global perspective and demonstrate the value of this global approach. Now, this perspective kind of goes hand in hand with the notion of critical information literacy. And I have to say that critical literacy is quite a departure from the simplistic understanding of information literacy that sometimes we come across as just the ability to read and write. And what you see here are the standards that an information literacy individual is expected to meet or is supposed to possess. And those are taken from the ACRL information literacy standards for higher education. And so looking here, I think quite reflective of our current information universe is the emphasis, the distinct emphasis that these standards place on evaluating information and its sources critically, and also thinking about the information we encounter in this critical context. And I think you all would agree that this is a much higher level of thinking that requires the capacity to situate that knowledge within the cultural and political and economic and, of course, social forces that affect our lives today. And this process overall involves both the teacher, the instructor, or the instructional librarian for that matter, or reference librarian perhaps, and the learner on the other side, as they look together at those political, social, and cultural dimensions of information itself, which includes, of course, information creation, dissemination, and use. So as a result, we can now speak about this indispensable critical thinking component of information literacy, which for us in the professional circles means simply a willingness to view the process of teaching and learning in, I think, new and different ways. And I would want to emphasize the word different because it means the evolving nature of the educational landscape. So overall, I am not going to say that adhering to the tenets of critical information literacy is an easy proposition. Well, not at all, because in practice, as I found myself, teaching information literacy skills, and I would say those threshold concepts, is a very prep intensive activity. So one of the top concerns for most librarians would probably be a lack of time. It sounds very mundane, but yes, a lack of time to do it properly, particularly when you're not exactly sure how you can scale your content up for larger size classes, perhaps, or a different subject area. So in other words, despite all the good intentions, we may not necessarily have the time to put everything we want to practice in this regard. And we have to admit that this is often due not only just to the time constraints themselves, but also due to a number of other institutional and professional boundaries and pressures that dictate what we can and cannot do sometimes with the resources we have. Although the motto is do more with less, and we try to do our best, that's not always possible. But despite the time constraints and concerns, another challenge is how to keep the learners engaged. And if you're an academic librarian in particular, how to ensure the buy-in from your teaching faculty, from your departmental faculty, right? So it's difficult to break through these barriers, if you will, because both learners and faculty, they may come to the library classroom or to the library building in general with any number of preconceived notions or expectations of what a typical library instruction session or maybe a reference interview should be. And you may experience disengagement, if not resistance, if the reality they face is not quite the same as their expectations. So the overarching question here is, how do you help students or information seekers meet the specific needs that they have, perhaps their academic work and course assignments, right, in the academe, while also teaching the critical socio-political dimensions of information in that broader global context? Well, that is a hard question to answer. And my answer would be that there's no one size fits all approach, but the success would certainly require for you as a librarian, as the instructor, to have a great deal of careful planning and communication with the faculty, and then with the information seekers, with the users themselves, about what they would like to teach, what they would like you to teach, and what they would like to learn, what those student learning outcomes you hope to achieve are, and how your instruction and your approach to designing your content may fit into the larger themes that they're exploring in a course or in a particular assignment. Another concern that I wanted to address very briefly here is the format of library instruction itself. And this is more pertinent to academic libraries, but I'm sure if you're a librarian in another setting, you can extrapolate those difficulties on your particular situation as well. But in academia, very often a librarian has to do what we call a one-shot library instruction session. And you are typically asked to teach undergraduate or maybe beginning level graduate students. And so many of them may not be quite prepared yet to think differently or critically about information in terms of its authority, bias, value, the process of information creation, the audience, or even purpose. So all those concepts that the threshold concepts, the frames are referring to, the students may not have the necessary foundation to think about those in a critical way. So obviously the key to building a platform for these conversations with information seekers and with learners starts with better understanding of our students or individuals we face in the library. This is challenging in and of itself, of course. When you think about the growing diversity, that's my last point here, the diversity of learners that we serve every day, no matter if you work in a public library sector where you may face up to 6 different generations of library users within a single day, whether you're an academic or special librarian working with first generation students or otherwise marginalized student groups, or whether you are, like I was, the liaison for Center for International Education, where my primary audience was obviously international or students with foreign backgrounds. As I have alluded to several times, I think we have to understand our students, our information users, to be successful with them. So we have to know what the experience is like for them in the first place when they leave their home country, in the case of international students, and try to get immersed into a completely different system of education and life, for that matter. And I will focus on what those categories of library users, of learners, may experience in a bit more detail right now. Let's see. Well, we spent some time talking about today's global economy and globalized world. And in a global world, or at least in a pre-COVID-19 version of it, we have to admit, international students would make up for a very important fraction of our student population. And in my eyes, they have to be really commended. They have to be lauded for the courage they have to go overseas and pursue educational, cultural, and social opportunities that are so unique to them from their perspectives. And if you ask me, this is a tall task to accomplish. So a double obstacle here, a double challenge is succeeding through an academic experience and ultimately earning your degree. Um, so this is why it does not really come as a huge surprise that many international students uh, can face or are prone to experiencing social isolation and, let's say, cultural adjustment, especially in the beginning of their experiences in this country. And if you want me to be more specific, one of the greatest challenges for them relates to obtaining information, right? Accessing information, finding information, and then, of course, communicating with faculty, with their classmates and staff, and all the other folks on campus. And this is one of the top reasons they may go through that period of social isolation when they engage in different group activities, including, by the way, information seeking or active learning endeavors that they're so often required to do in their classes. And then on the other side, culturally, they need to confront the different ways of thinking and doing things that we have in this country. And yet we, on the other side, as instructors, as educators, librarians, as facilitators of learning, we have to do our best to help them accommodate to this new life. And they are, by them I mean international students, they're so important because they contribute to the diversity within the classroom, on campus, and then within the larger community. And I want to reemphasize this fact that international students and also other categories of learners, information seekers that may be marginalized along maybe ethnic, gender, racial, or social lines, they are the very definition of diversity and inclusion. So it's not just the abstract concepts, it's just the people that embody diversity. And this is why we just have to keep our focus where it should be, especially in these challenging times. Well, for international students, for example, they add a different perspective in the classroom. And so they enhance that global awareness that I've kept talking about so much today. And this is something that, in my mind, the world so desperately needs right now. Okay, moving on, the bottom line is that I think it's very imperative for librarians to try and become more culturally competent or culturally cognizant, if you will, if we hope to provide equally high quality of service to everyone who enters the library. And here in this slide, we are looking at the diversity standards. And those of you who work in academic library environments, I'm sure would be familiar with those because ACRL developed these standards, I think, back in 2012. And so by creating this document, ACRL basically said that, you know, in order to serve our diverse constituencies effectively, we have to develop the skills necessary to do so. And so what follows is that being culturally competent goes a little bit beyond just your personality, your natural inclinations, or what your gut feeling may be about behaving in a certain situation. According to ACRL, there are specific areas of performance that can and should be developed both on an individual and I would say on the organizational level here. And so we have to fully address those areas and pay attention to them if we want to be successful in creating inclusive environments that serve the needs of all of our users, especially those that have been traditionally underserved or, you know, otherwise just underrepresented. So what you see here in this slide listed in brief are the standards, and the full document goes in much more detail about what each of the standards mean and how they can be implemented in practical terms. So going back to my case, when I thought about having international students in my classroom at the University of Northern Colorado as the liaison for the Center for International Education, I already knew that these standards existed. And so I naturally thought about how they could be best integrated into my work with that very specific and important library audience. But a couple of words about the CIE, as we call it, or the Center for International Education. This is actually, as you might assume, one of the key agencies on campus. And what they do is basically work to advance the university teaching, research, and service missions. But the difference is that unlike many academic departments that may be siloed or working in a bit of isolation, CIE is all about building collaborations. And I want to stress this term, collaborations, throughout the campus to promote global engagement and also advance diversity. And I think they've been amazingly successful in this because they just increase opportunities for students and faculty to study internationally and also develop long-term strategic partnerships abroad. So in this role, the center is very, very active on campus, and especially important is that they interact with the campus leadership, the provost and the president, because the ultimate goal here is to elevate the global profile of the campus of the university in this particular academic community. So, but the main reason CIE exists actually is to help the students, the international students, throughout their academic and cultural experience. And so the relationship between CIE and the library, on the other hand, in my estimation, evolved over time from virtually non-existent and at some point to highly, highly collaborative and supportive right now. So specifically, they work with the library not only on things like information literacy instruction, obviously, to those user groups, but also on reviving the intensive English program and organizing events like International Game Night or International Food Festival, et cetera, et cetera. My primary job with CIE was to provide library instruction, of course, to introduce international students and visiting scholars to how research is done in this country, what information literacy means in an information dependent society, and how to navigate the academic universe and avoid the multiple pitfalls like plagiarism, for example, or copyright violations that so many individuals with foreign background may not be as aware of as your typical US-based student would be. And that is just to name a few things. Okay, let me move on. So every year, we would typically host a couple of cohorts of international students and exchange scholars. And of course, they stayed at the university for different lengths of time. And I think this picture is from 2019. This is a cohort of education majors from the Capital Normal University in China. They stayed on campus for just about 6 weeks because they came to take a couple of summer classes from the College of Education. But having said that, there was a heavy research component in both of those courses. So my job was to develop several different instruction sessions for them. And I have to admit, it was quite an interesting experience because, you know, for the majority of those students, they had never been to this country before. And so they just had a very, very vague idea, a slight idea of what to expect on a university campus. So as they came into my classroom, they were still going through this quite difficult transition time, having to do everything at once, like soaking in life in the United States, dealing with the time zones, the time differences, the technology barriers, connecting to the campus Wi-Fi, and also making progress in their classes because they had to face the same academic requirements as your regular student would. And at the same time, they had to complete some library research and actually present it in their classes. So when I started to plan my library instruction for them, I just thought, well, no, wait a second, I cannot possibly approach it in a typical, old-fashioned way. This just does not work with this particular group of students, and I really have to go beyond the normal click here and click there and save this file in full text and cite it. This approach is not really useful. And so the key for me was to try and relate to the students somehow, understand them as people, as difficult as it may sound, and get them interested in working together with me, if you will, during the short times that we had as a group. Essentially, what it meant was that I had to become more culturally competent. Speaking of competencies, I had to become more culturally cognizant myself as the instructor before I could talk about those abstract threshold concepts and the value of thinking about information in a critical way. So what you see here is a diagram for building blocks to cultural competence. I decided to use this in my process. In a nutshell, it starts from scratch, like ground zero, and it operates on the notion that as human beings, we have a tendency and a predication to engage in cultural self-reflection. And also we like to reflect on other cultures just a bit. And so once we begin this process of reflection, this is already a positive sign, because that means that our level of cultural competencies slowly starts to rise. And among the things that increase that level would be, of course, traveling, reading, communication, and sure enough, learning in different cultural environments. It's exactly what my students were experiencing at the time. And finally, during stage 3 here, as you bring in more professional development or maybe hands-on opportunities into this framework, you are able to move just beyond the initial competence into higher level of proficiency. And I have to say that I was maybe fortunate because those students had plenty of hands-on experiences in their educational technology course, especially. Now, still going back to this diagram, I think you all realize that this achieving cultural competence or enhancing the level of your cultural cognizance is a long-term undertaking, and maybe I would say it's a lifelong aspiration for some. So this is why I am not even going to talk about the last level, which is the full cultural proficiency. It's in box number 4 on the right. And that means changes in policy standards and practices. I think it would have been unrealistic for me to hope to achieve that during the 6 weeks stay for this group and also for my teaching for this group. But I think what we accomplished was a good start. So in more specific terms, my strategy was to try and connect with those students on a personal level from the first time I was introduced to them as their subject librarian, as their liaison. The good thing was that I had been to China before on a couple of occasions, so I used that opportunity to greet the students in their native language very briefly, and then I kind of talked about my experiences in China a little bit, just a little bit, before we moved on to the instruction session itself. And I have to say that was a perfect icebreaker, which I could see it definitely warmed them up to everything I had to say afterwards. So, and then as I taught the basic literacy concepts or search strategies, I made a special effort to refer to their cultural background, because that was a very effective way to make my instruction more relevant and more meaningful to them. For example, when we talked about selecting a topic for your database searching, I would ask them about their favorite food, right? Both in China and now in the United States. Or when later on they had to construct their own queries, I would just, walk around the room and observe the process. If I saw that they looked to be stuck in the search, or they looked to have missed something from my explanation, I would use the strategic questioning technique, right, to right the ship, so to speak. And then I would make sure they could move on with their searches. But I have to say that the most exciting but yet difficult part was the think out loud protocols that we also used, where I asked for some volunteers to talk us through their search experiences, yes, in English. And then something that definitely went a lot easier with all of them, I would say, was the think, pair, share exercises, another form of assessment. Um, we did those at the very end, and I just let it go, and I simply asked the students to just discuss what they had found with their partner, with the pair, and evaluate the resources they now had in their possession. And I think it was a very, very good way to reinforce the learning, because it was essentially pressure-free. The students, they could speak in their native language, and they did not feel the pressure to report back to the instructor or maybe to the whole classroom. And so before we come to the conclusion part of my talk today, I wanted to share a few takeaways from that experience that hopefully may be helpful to you as well, as far as the evaluation is concerned. Well, to begin with, I had a predetermined set of student learning outcomes that I had coordinated with the teaching faculty. And I also used both the formative and the summative assessment to evaluate how well, or in some cases, how poorly we managed to achieve those learning outcomes. Overall, it was not really very easy because I had to deal with various forms of data in a short period of time. I experimented. It was an experiment with various techniques like curriculum coherence, which was essentially going back and forth between my own lesson plans and the course syllabi, and then the feedback from the teaching faculty. I also used, I think, the difficulty estimation and the dependence estimation techniques to find out just the correlation, the relationship between certain learning outcomes, like facilitating strategic searching a strategic exploration. And I had a worksheet for that, by the way. So those learning outcomes and my consistent references to student cultural backgrounds. So my goal in doing all this was just to put myself as the instructor in a position where I could again make changes on the fly if necessary. But above all, the main outcome that I want to highlight to you all here from my vantage point was a clear increase in their self-awareness. Now, I realize this is not very tangible, as well as things like shared cultural knowledge and sensitivity to cultural differences. And yes, these outcomes are hard to accomplish and hard to measure in a course of library instruction, particularly involving a minority population. So a major takeaway for me was that this type of experience and this type of approach to information literacy instruction kind of helps to put critical information literacy on the one hand and cultural competencies on the other, both in the spotlight. And despite all the ongoing, continuing conversation about these topics, I think they deserve much more attention in the age of information overload, with all of its turmoil and with all of its excitement, I would say right now, despite the turmoil. So what is in it for us, for librarians, for instructors, for educators? My goal today has been to lay out my experience with adopting a critical information literacy stance to teaching basic literacy skills and also incorporating cultural competencies component into it at the same time. And my hope, of course, you feel free to provide your feedback, but my hope is that you personally would feel a little bit more at ease about working with library users that we call non-traditional, whether those are international students or maybe economically disadvantaged user groups or members of the LGBTQ community, you name it. Because I think what unites all of them is that they're all different from the mainstream, right? So working with these populations and especially teaching for them, as I was, definitely means getting out of your comfort zone to some extent and also being creative or thinking critically, no pun intended, but thinking critically about your own teaching philosophy, right? And the specific instructional technique as well. And in a way, it is called teaching against the grain. So at the end of the day, why would we choose to do that all of a sudden, right? Why is this teaching against the grain? Why is it a legitimate approach? Well, if you ask me, first and foremost, this is a student-centered approach. So for me, having a basis in critical information literacy and cultural competencies enabled me to become a more engaged instructor, a more engaged librarian, and connect to my students on a more profound level than I would have been able to do in a different circumstance. And I can say that it also, teaching in this non-traditional way, allowed me to be more self-reflective, both in my prep and also during my teaching. It kind of challenged me to go outside of my comfort zone, as I said, because I had to know exactly what to do in front of the class. But in the beginning, I was definitely uncomfortable to some extent if I did not have a specific lesson plan that I could follow to a T. But I'm a firm believer now that students actually learn better and learn more when we are not really following that prescribed plan, every single letter in that plan or lesson outline. And instead, if we allow for some divergence, they learn better in this way. So then also focusing on students themselves, you are bringing their needs or their existing knowledge or perspectives, their funds of knowledge, so to say, to the forefront as much as possible. And by that, you really give that knowledge, that background, a renewed sense of purpose, a new meaning and a sense of urgency, which, in my mind, ultimately makes learning more enjoyable and fun. So you are giving them the tools to relate the information they're supposed to learn in the library to what they may be doing in their classes or in their lives in a very meaningful way. And this is a very, very rewarding experience to have. So finally, I have to say, if you're able to address both critical information literacy and cultural competencies in the course of a single instruction session or maybe a number of instruction modules, to me, you are very well on your way to having a deeper conversation with your good old library colleagues or maybe teaching faculty. And that means sharing your pedagogical approaches, staying involved, sharing your passions. And we often are perhaps too busy or we simply neglect to do that in our normal lives, I would say. And I believe this type of intellectual exchange makes not only learning, but also teaching itself enjoyable and fun. So before we end the presentation and before we get to the Q&A section, actually, I wanted to make sure I mention a couple of useful resources on cultural competence. If you just look around, if you're a newcomer, if you're new to this area of research and practice, a lot of the resources, a lot of the articles and websites and training kits, etc., on this topic, they have to do with the medical field for some reason, like community health education, addiction studies, maybe social work, etc. But here I am listing a couple of places you can consult if you are looking to read about cultural competencies education for librarians. So the school library journal, it has the diversity and cultural literacy toolkit, and it features quite an extensive list of resources like articles and videos and other content that has been previously used in various in-person or virtual training, cultural literacy education, opportunities for librarians. And then my second link or my second reference here is the Library Juice Academy course. They have designed and offering a designated course, Cultural Competence for Librarians. It is actually coming up later this year in April and also August. And I think it's part of the Certificate for Diversity and Inclusion Skills. It's a curriculum. And so if you have not taken the course yet, I would highly recommend that you at least take a look at it, because this course is a great overview of what it means to be culturally competent in the first place in the library and information science professions. And especially, I think they will focus on how to apply the cultural competence techniques to your professional practice. Now, I have to say here, to be quite honest with you, it is $175, yes. But if you in your library, if you have some professional development funds, I would argue that's, money well spent. And also, of course, I have listed some books here, and this is all useful and interesting read. So make sure you check them out if you have time. Obviously, there are a lot more resources on this topic, and I would be happy to share them with you. And also, I would really look forward to hearing from you, because I am just excited to learn more myself. As I said at one point, becoming more culturally cognizant or increasing the level of your cultural competencies is a lifelong aspiration. So I feel committed to this, and I would definitely look forward to your input. So this is the end of my presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them right now through the chat, perhaps, or contact me directly, contact me separately if this is your preference. My email is listed right here, and I think this is the best way to reach me. With that, I thank you for your attention. Thank you for being here. And let's see if we have any questions. Yeah, thank you, Sammy. Thank you for being here. And yeah, look forward to having you as one of my students. Okay, well. No questions, huh? It was a ton of.
Hello, can I pose a question?
Yes, absolutely.
My name is Manisha, and I work with the Muscogees Cultural College in Alberta, Canada. Excellent presentation, Mr. Trambach. I enjoyed so many different resources and your personal experience. Think, pair, share. So my question is, how are international students being served and this information literacy now in this online environment?
Yes, this is a great question, Anisha. Thank you for asking that. I think definitely the ongoing pandemic, the number one thing it has meant for all of us, I think, yes, this is a challenge, but it has also meant a change in the approach for academic libraries and for public libraries, for that matter, a change in their approach to providing resources, access to resources, providing services, including information literacy instruction. And I am currently doing a research project, in fact, on how mid-sized academic libraries have responded to the challenges of the pandemic. And this is one of the questions my partners and I are asking our research participants. And I have to say that overall, in my estimation, libraries have done a great job to stay connected. The number one thing is to stay connected with the students as much as they can through various means, but of course, through their online presence, updating their websites, staying active on their social media channels, using outlets like perhaps Centers for International Education or maybe community centers to reach out to those students and just keep them informed about a number of ways information and library resources can be accessed in this day and age. Because although a lot of the libraries have been closed or just closed for a period of time last year, it doesn't mean that their focus went away from all of the target audiences, in particular international students. And in my experience and what I'm hearing from the library leadership in this research project, they have made a concerted effort to keep their focus where it should be, honestly, and that is on those diverse, underserved, or underrepresented populations to which international students definitely belong. So overall, I think it's a variety of ways to reach out to this particular group of students. And in a sense, it's no different from what you expect about the library work with a typical campus population, except that libraries would use additional channels like International Students and Scholar Services Office or Centers for International Education to make sure their outreach remains strong and consistent in these challenging times.
Dr. Trembach, what we don't know, we don't know. In terms of international students, their library use habits, behavior, and the infrastructure available to them um, was different in a campus environment. And with online everywhere across the world, digitization and digital way is consistently being seen. What you don't know, you don't know. I'm saying these words again. Um, so there could be some services which international students have not used, or their home libraries were not able to offer them. So how do we open their eyes to the potential, um, and that library is your learning partner for life, and there are so many services which are available? What I have not eaten, I don't know. I have not tasted it. How do I discover the beautiful, the awesome library services which are offered, which can help me as an international student? I'm just saying myself, like as an international student, succeed.
Yes, absolutely. And this is a great way to put it. Yes. If you haven't tried something, you don't know what it tastes, right? And I think actually, I absolutely agree with you that this is an emerging and a developing area of research and practice, looking at the international student behaviors in a purely online or primarily online environment and their ways of accessing and processing digital information. Because especially for those coming, let's say, um, uh, from not your typical destination like China, maybe, or Eastern Asia, they may not be so much used to this overabundance of digital content. So how they interact with that content is very much a subject of attention for practitioners and scholars alike. And I think here lies a great opportunity that this pandemic has afforded us. Aside from the challenges, this is the opportunity to kind of up our level of knowledge in this regard. But thank you for bringing up this important point, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr.
Um,
Trambach, for answering my questions. I sincerely appreciate it.
Absolutely. I am glad we had this exchange. And okay, let's see. Now I see a comment in the chat asking me to address the difficulty of teaching topics like copyright and plagiarism, yes, to students where this is completely foreign to their cultural understanding. Well, yes, thank you. I think this was Dr. Smith. Again, thank you for raising this question. Yes, this is really a challenge because in this regard, when it comes to these topics, very often they are coming to the library or to your instruction sessions with a clean slate and making references to their background is only helpful in a limited way, I would say. When you approach a complex topic like copyright, what you can say is that I am not sure if you have ever heard of this or if you've had to deal with it in your academic experience in your home countries, but this is how things are done in the United States. And of course, this is a tall task to accomplish all by yourself as an instructional or reference librarian for that matter. So if a question on copyright say arises, I think it would make sense to approach it collectively and collaboratively and invite the expertise of some of your library colleagues, perhaps a copyright or a law librarian if you have one. And also remember to bring the attention of the learners, of students, of information seekers to the online resources that the library definitely has in its possession, like a LibGuide on copyright and plagiarism, perhaps, or maybe YouTube videos, etc. And those resources, coupled with your own instruction, I think, would ultimately be successful in explaining those difficult concepts to the students in a kind of a structured way. And then lastly, I have to mention in this regard, the buy-in from the departmental faculty. You have to make sure you are on the same page as far as the treatment of copyright and plagiarism is concerned, and that what you're telling students in the course of your library instruction does not really contradict what the faculty may have told them before or what the faculty's approach to plagiarism is. So you have to be on the same page and consistent in your instruction and in your take on the material. But yeah, I agree. This is a very, very important topic to consider when you are engaging in planning and prep for your instruction session. Thank you for asking, Dr. Smith. All right, let's see if we have any other questions at this point. And once again, I don't want to put you on the spot so much right now. If you happen to think about a burning question or a burning remark you would like me to know based on what we discussed today, again, feel free to reach out, send me an email, and especially if you have any resources to share that relate to either critical literacy, cultural competencies, or how to blend them together in the course of a one-shot library instruction session, perhaps. All right, if we have no other questions, I would like to once again thank you for participation. You may have noticed that there are other SLIM webinars coming up, so please stay tuned for those learning opportunities. And thank you for your interest and thank you for your support of SLIM. Stay safe and healthy, everyone, and have a great start of the semester for those of you in academia. Thank you very much. Have a great day.